My son raised his crystal glass at the center of the mahogany dining table, the expensive red wine catching the golden light of the chandelier. He looked around at the small gathering of guests, let a cruel smirk crawl across his face, and said, "Maybe this will be Dad's last Christmas in this house." Everyone at the table laughed softly. His wife Monica clinked her glass against his, her eyes gleaming with something cold and hungry. I just sat there at the head of the table. The very same table I had built with my own 2 hands 40 years ago. I did not yell. I did not throw my plate. I simply smiled, raised my own glass, and whispered to family. But the next morning, when my son walked into my kitchen and saw exactly who was sitting at my breakfast table, his face drained completely of blood. If you are watching this, hit the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from today, because the story I am about to tell you is going to make you question everything you know about the people you share your blood with. The air in the dining room was thick with the rich smell of the extravagant beef Wellington Brad had insisted on bringing up from the city. He was slicing it with a flourish, talking loudly about his latest investments and his busy corporate life. But my eyes were not on the meat. They were fixed on his left wrist. As the sleeve of his tailored Italian shirt pulled back, the soft ambient light caught the unmistakable gleam of a Patek Philippe watch. I know watches. I have admired them my whole life. That particular model, the Nautilus in rose gold, does not sell for anything less than $80,000. And now here he was, wearing an $80,000 timepiece, pouring a $500 bottle of Cabernet, and joking about my imminent departure from the farm I had worked for over 4 decades. The math simply did not add up. I looked across the table at Monica. She was picking at her food, occasionally casting disgusted glances around my home. This house, sitting on 600 acres of prime Hudson Valley real estate, was rustic. It had creaky floorboards, old plumbing, and a draft in the winter. It was not the sleek, modern penthouse she felt she deserved. She had always looked at me not as a father-in-law, but as an obstacle, a stubborn old stump standing in the way of a massive inheritance. "So, Dad," Brad said, suddenly pulling me from my thoughts, "how have you been feeling lately? You seemed a little confused on the phone last week. You forgot my assistant's name again." He said it with a tone of mock concern, but his eyes were sharp. He was testing me. Monica exchanged a very quick, very deliberate look with Brad. It was barely a second, a micro-expression, but I caught it. It was a predator's glance. "Well, you really need to be careful," Monica chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Living all the way out here by yourself is not safe anymore. What if you leave the stove on? What if you wander out into the snow and cannot find your way back?" "I have the dog," I said gently, reaching down to pet the old sheepdog resting faithfully at my feet. "A dog cannot call an ambulance, Richard," she replied, taking a long sip of her wine. "Brad and I were just talking about how much better it would be if you were somewhere supervised. Somewhere with professionals who can really take care of your declining cognitive state." The words hung heavily in the air. Declining cognitive state. They were laying the groundwork. They were building a narrative right in front of my face. I did not argue. I did not get angry. Decades in the Marine Corps had taught me one fundamental rule of combat. Never let the enemy know you have spotted their ambush. "Maybe you are right," I murmured, staring down at my plate with a defeated sigh. "Maybe I am getting too old to run this place." Brad leaned back in his chair, visibly relaxing his shoulders. He thought he had won. He thought his old man was finally breaking down, becoming a docile, manageable problem that could simply be swept away. I stayed downstairs ostensibly to clean up the kitchen. Eventually, the house grew completely quiet. The only sound was the howling of the winter wind outside and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the long hallway. It was 3 in the morning. I had not slept a single wink. My body ached with arthritis, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. The gut feeling that had saved my life in the jungles decades ago was screaming at me now. Something was deeply, horribly wrong under my own roof. I walked quietly into the darkened living room. The pale moonlight filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting long, twisted shadows across the hardwood floor. On the sofa, Monica had carelessly tossed her expensive Hermes handbag. The zipper was slightly open. I stood there for a long moment. A decent father should not snoop through his family's belongings. But the trusting father had died at the dinner table. Only the soldier remained. I reached into the bag. My fingers brushed against the cold leather of her wallet, moving past it to a thick manila envelope tucked into the side compartment. I carefully pulled it out, my calloused hands sliding the documents free into the moonlight. Even in the dim light, the bold heading on the first page made my blood run completely cold. It was a medical power of attorney. I skimmed the dense legal jargon until I reached the bottom of the page. There, sitting starkly on the signature line, was my name. Richard Dawson. It was my handwriting. Every loop, every slant perfectly replicated. But I had never signed this document in my life. They were not just trying to take the farm. They were planning to legally kidnap me, lock me away in a facility for severe dementia patients, and effectively bury me alive so they could take total control of my $18 million estate. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked directly above my head. Someone was awake. I quickly slipped the papers back into the envelope, slid it perfectly into the Hermes bag, and stepped silently back into the shadows. The game had just changed, and my son had absolutely no idea what kind of war he had just started. The creaking sound echoed through the silent house again, much louder this time. I held my breath and pressed my back against the cold plaster wall of the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps were moving down the wooden staircase. It was not Monica. Her steps were always light and hurried. This was Brad. I melted deeper into the shadows near the old grandfather clock, making sure the Hermes bag on the sofa looked exactly as it had before I touched it. I did not go back to sleep. I went into my study, locked the solid oak door behind me, and opened my laptop. For the next 3 hours, I worked in the glow of the screen. Decades ago, I served in military intelligence before returning home to take over the family farm. You never really lose those skills. You just put them on a shelf. I reached out to an old friend, a former Marine who now ran a private investigation firm in Chicago. I sent him the name on the medical documents, Dr. Aris Thorne, along with the corporate name listed on the Pine Haven deposit receipt. By 6 in the morning, my friend had sent me a secure, encrypted file. The contents of that file were the exact ammunition I needed to fight back. At 7 o'clock sharp, the sun began to rise over the Hudson Valley, casting a brilliant orange glow across the thick snow. I was in the kitchen frying bacon and brewing a fresh pot of dark roast coffee. The smell drifted upstairs, doing exactly what it was meant to do. I heard the shower turn off in the guest bathroom. 10 minutes later, Brad walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes and yawning loudly. He was wearing an expensive cashmere sweater, looking every bit the successful hedge fund manager he pretended to be. "Morning, Dad," he mumbled, walking straight toward the coffee pot. "Smells great." "Good morning, Brad," I replied warmly, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon onto the large oak dining table. I poured a cup of coffee and set it down. But I did not set it down at Brad's usual spot. I set it down directly across from a man who was already sitting quietly at the far end of the table. Brad turned around, mug in hand, and stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened so far I thought they might pop out of his skull. All the color instantly vanished from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, chalky white. The ceramic coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering into dozens of pieces on the terracotta floor tiles. Hot black coffee splashed against his expensive leather slippers, but he did not even flinch. He could not take his eyes off the guest sitting in my kitchen. Sitting there, wearing a rumpled gray suit and sweating profusely, was Dr. Aris Thorne, The good doctor looked absolutely terrified. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold the paper napkin I had given him. He kept looking from Brad to me, then back to Brad like a trapped animal trying to find an exit. What? Brad stammered, his voice cracking violently. What is going on here? Who is this man? Now, Brad, I said softly, taking a seat at the head of the table. You know it is not polite to pretend you do not recognize a friend, especially a friend you paid $100,000 to just last week. Brad swallowed hard, taking a slow step backward toward the hallway. I do not know what you are talking about, Dad. I have never seen this man in my life. I think your mind is playing tricks on you again. I smiled a cold, empty smile that did not reach my eyes. I reached under the folded newspaper resting on the table and pulled out my tablet. I slid it smoothly across the polished wood until it stopped right at the edge of the table, directly in front of Brad. The screen was brilliantly bright. It displayed a high-resolution bank statement. Specifically, an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands under Dr. Thorne's name. Highlighted in bright yellow was a wire transfer for exactly $100,000 originating from a shell corporation that I knew for a fact Brad controlled. Dr. Thorne was kind enough to drive up here early this morning after my private investigator knocked on his door. At 5 o'clock, I explained calmly, sipping my coffee. It turns out the doctor has a terrible gambling problem and some very aggressive creditors. He was more than happy to explain how you approached him, paid him to forge a medical evaluation, declaring me legally incompetent, and drafted that power of attorney hidden upstairs in your wife's handbag. Brad was suffocating on the heavy silence in the room. He looked at Thorne, hoping the doctor would deny it. But Thorne just stared at the table, refusing to make eye contact. You were going to lock me in Pine Haven, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. You were going to steal my farm. The farm where your mother is buried. The farm where you grew up. Dad, please. Brad choked out, his knees visibly shaking now. You do not understand. I can explain everything. It is not what it looks like. Then explain it, I said, folding my hands together on the table. Make me understand, Brad, because right now the only thing I understand is that I need to call the authorities and have you both arrested for conspiracy and fraud. Brad collapsed to his knees right in the middle of the spilled coffee and shattered ceramic. He buried his face in his hands and began to sob loudly. The confident, arrogant executive from last night was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, desperate child. Please do not call the police, he begged, his voice muffled by his shaking hands. I had no choice, Dad. I had absolutely no choice. They are going to kill me. They are going to kill Monica. They are going to hurt Leo. The mention of my 10-year-old autistic grandson made my chest tighten, but I did not let it show on my face. I simply tilted my head and waited for the lie. I owe money, Brad cried, looking up at me with tear-streaked cheeks. Not to a bank, to very bad people, an underground syndicate in the city. I made some terrible investments, I tried to cover them up, and now I am in debt for millions. They told me if I do not pay them by the end of the month, they will take it out on my family. Pine Haven was just a cover story. I was going to send you there temporarily to hide you, to keep you safe from them. I just need to sell a small 10-acre corner of the farm to pay them off. Just 10 acres, Dad. I swear to you, it was all to protect you. I looked down at the man kneeling on my floor. It was a beautiful, plausible lie, delivered with perfect, desperate emotion. A lesser man, a softer father might have believed it, but I knew the truth. I let out a long, heavy sigh, letting my shoulders slump, as if the weight of his words had finally broken my resolve. I stood up slowly, walked over to him, and placed a gentle hand on his trembling shoulder. Stand up, son, I whispered, my voice thick with fake emotion. Why did you not just tell me? I will sign whatever you need to save my grandson. Brad let out a shuddering breath of relief, leaning into my hand. But as he turned his face away to wipe his tears, he could not see my other hand. He could not see my fingers reach under the thick wooden lip of the kitchen table and press the stop button on the digital micro recorder I had taped there 3 hours ago. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, echoing through the farmhouse. Outside, the winter sun broke the horizon, casting pale beams across the snow. I stood at the counter, calmly measuring coffee beans. The rhythmic grinding filled the silence, a mechanical sound, matching the coldness settling into my chest. I had not slept since my discovery. Every instinct honed during my years in the service was fully awake, humming with dangerous energy. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait. Right on schedule, headlights cut through the morning fog. A sleek sedan pulled into the gravel driveway. The engine cut off, but the driver did not immediately get out. I watched from the window, knowing exactly who was in that car and how terrified he was. A few minutes later, there was a hesitant knock at the oak door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, letting a blast of freezing wind into the warm kitchen. Standing on the porch, shivering in an expensive overcoat, was Dr. Aris Thorne. He looked nothing like the confident neurologist, whose smiling face was plastered all over his Manhattan Clinic's website. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. "Good morning, Dr. Thorne," I said smoothly, stepping aside. He practically stumbled over the threshold. My private investigator, the former military intelligence officer I contacted at 3 in the morning, had been thorough. He intercepted Thorne leaving his mistress's apartment at 5. A few photographs, a copy of the forged evaluation, and a reminder of federal penalties convinced the doctor to visit. "Sit down," I commanded softly, pointing to the wooden chair at the far end of the dining table. Thorne obeyed instantly, sinking into the chair. I poured him a mug of black coffee and set it down. He wrapped his shaking hands around the warm ceramic, unable to meet my eyes. The silence in the kitchen was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the crackling of the firewood I had just added to the hearth. Minutes before 8 o'clock, heavy footsteps sounded on the staircase. Brad was awake. He descended slowly, his steps dragging with the distinct heaviness of a severe hangover. I could hear him muttering to himself, nursing a headache from the expensive wine he paraded around the night before. I stood near the sink, washing my hands, my face an absolute mask of elderly innocence. "Dad, are you making coffee?" Brad called out, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. I feel like my head is going to split wide open. He stepped through the arched doorway into the kitchen, rubbing his temples, his eyes half closed. "Smells good," he mumbled, taking 2 steps toward the counter before finally looking up. The moment his eyes registered the scene, the change was instantaneous. Brad stopped dead in his tracks. The irritation vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer terror. All the color drained from his cheeks. His jaw dropped slightly, and his breath hitched in his throat. He looked at me, standing calmly by the sink, and then his eyes locked onto the man sitting at the far end of the table. Dr. Thorne looked up from his mug, his expression a mixture of guilt and panic. He gave Brad a pathetic, helpless look, silently begging for a way out of the nightmare he had been dragged into. Brad's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled out of water. He tried to take a step backward, but his foot caught the edge of the rug, and he stumbled clumsily, catching himself against the doorframe. What he finally managed to croak out, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "What is going on here? Who is this?" I dried my hands on a towel, letting the silence stretch until it was unbearable. "Why, Brad?" I said mildly. "Do you mean to tell me you do not recognize your own physician?" Dr. Thorne drove all the way from the city just to check on my declining cognitive state. Brad swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming on his pale forehead. "Dad, I do not know what you are talking about. I have never seen this man before. I think you are confused. You are having an episode." The sheer audacity of the lie delivered right to my face extinguished the last spark of paternal warmth I had left. Confused, I repeated dropping the grandfather act and taking on the sharp edge of a commanding officer. Let us see just how confused I am. I walked to the kitchen island, picked up my tablet, and slid it firmly across the dining table. It stopped 1 inch from Brad's fingertips. He looked at the glowing screen as if it were a live grenade. On the display was a detailed spreadsheet showing the transaction history of a secure offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Go ahead, Brad, I instructed, my voice echoing coldly in the room. Read the highlighted section out loud for the doctor. Brad's eyes darted across the screen. His hands shook just as violently as Thorne's. Right there, highlighted in yellow, was a wire transfer of exactly $100,000. The recipient account belonged to Eris Thorne. The sending account was a corporate entity Brad used to hide his assets. $100,000, I stated clearly. A steep price for a simple house call, would you not agree? Or is that the going rate for a fabricated medical diagnosis of severe dementia? Brad looked up at me, his eyes wide with an absolute desperate animalistic panic. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin another lie, to weave another excuse, but absolutely no words came out. He was completely trapped, pinned down by the undeniable proof of his own treachery, while the doctor he had bribed sat sweating bullets across the room, completely broken by the massive crushing weight of his own terrible guilt. Dr. Thorne broke first. The silence was too much for his fragile conscience. With a violent flinch, he pushed himself away from the table. The heavy wooden chair scraped against the tiles and crashed onto the floor. He did not say a word. He bolted for the door like a terrified rabbit. The front door slammed shut, rattling the windows. Outside, his car engine roared to life, tires spinning against the gravel, before tearing off down the road, leaving my son alone to face the consequences. The sound of the retreating car severed the last string holding Brad together. His legs gave out. He collapsed onto the kitchen floor, right into the pool of spilled coffee and shattered ceramic pieces. He did not care that the sharp fragments were pressing into his expensive trousers. He buried his face in his hands, and a loud agonizing wail tore from his throat. It was not the quiet cry of a man facing his mistakes. It was the theatrical sobbing of a cornered animal trying to evoke pity. Dad, I am so sorry. He gasped, his chest heaving as he rocked back and forth. I am so sorry. You do not understand what is actually happening. I stood motionless, leaning against the kitchen island, watching this pathetic display of manipulation. I kept my face entirely impassive. Explain it to me then, I said flatly. Explain why you paid a doctor $100,000 to declare me insane. Explain why you forged my name on a power of attorney to steal the farm I bled for. I am not trying to steal it, Brad cried out, looking up with red, tear-filled eyes. I am trying to save my family. Dad, I am trying to save Leo. He knew exactly what he was doing. Mentioning my 10-year-old autistic grandson was a calculated strike aimed directly at the softest part of my heart. He knew Leo was my weakness. I felt a sharp spike of anger flare in my chest, but I suppressed it. I simply raised an eyebrow and waited for him to continue spinning his web. I made a mistake, Brad choked out, wiping his face. A huge mistake. Last year, the market took a massive downturn. My fund was bleeding money. I was facing total ruin, and the bank was ready to seize our house. I panicked. I went to people I never should have gone to. Private lenders in the city. Men who operate completely outside the law. They gave me the capital I needed, he continued, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. But the interest was astronomical. When I could not make the payments, they stopped calling my office and started showing up at the house. Last week, 2 men cornered Monica in the grocery store parking lot. They knew where Leo goes to school. They told her that if I do not pay them $5 million by the end of this month, they are going to kill my wife and hurt my son. Tears streamed down his face. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime. If I had not already discovered his massive gambling debts and the corporate buyout documents, I might have believed every poisonous word. And the doctor, I asked softly. The lockdown facility. How exactly does betraying your own father factor into this crusade to save your family? Brad crawled forward, his hands gripping the edge of the dining table. I had to get you out of this house, he pleaded. These men are ruthless. When they realize I do not have the cash, they will come looking for assets. They know you live out here all alone. I was terrified they would show up in the middle of the night and do something horrible to you to force my hand. He looked up at me with manufactured sincerity. Pine Haven was never meant to be a prison, Dad. It was a safe house. It is a secure facility with 24-hour security. I needed to hide you somewhere they could not reach you. I paid Dr. Thorne to write that evaluation so I could legally move you there without drawing attention. It was the only way to keep you safe while I dealt with these monsters. And the power of attorney I prompted, gently playing the confused old man. I just need 10 acres, Brad begged, his voice breaking into a whine. Just the 10 acres by the old creek. It is completely useless land anyway. I have a buyer lined up who is willing to pay above market value, but the buyer needs a clean title immediately. With the syndicate breathing down my neck, I do not have time to go through standard legal channels, and the bank will not finalize the transfer without my name on the deed. I was only going to use the document for that one transaction. I swear to God, just 10 acres to pay off the debt and keep Leo safe. He let his head drop onto his arms, sobbing loudly into his sleeves. Please, Dad, he cried. I am begging you. Do not let them hurt Leo. Do not let my stupidity cost my son his life. I know I went about this the wrong way, and I should have just been honest from the start. But I was so ashamed that I had failed as a husband and as a father. Please, you have to believe me. I stood silently there in the quiet kitchen. He was a true master manipulator. He had seamlessly woven his fear, his shame, and a grandfather's love into a perfect shield. He thought he had completely outsmarted me. He thought the mention of Leo's safety would blind me to all logic and reason. He was absolutely certain that I was about to forgive him, comfort him, and willingly hand over my legacy. He had no idea I was about to destroy him. I silently looked down at the man sobbing on my kitchen floor. He was surrounded by all the shattered pieces of a ceramic coffee mug and a cooling puddle of dark roast. For a fleeting moment, I searched his face for any trace of the little boy who used to run across the pastures. I looked for the boy I had taught to ride a horse and shoot a hunting rifle. But there was absolutely nothing left of my son in those eyes. The tears streaming down his cheeks were not born of genuine remorse or fear for his family. They were a calculated weapon deployed by a desperate predator cornered by his own overwhelming greed. He was exploiting my love for my grandson, twisting it into a knife to hold against my throat. It was the ultimate betrayal. But I could not let him see the cold, calculating fury building inside my chest. I had to play my part perfectly. I let out a long, ragged breath, allowing my shoulders to sag heavily. I let my hands begin to tremble just a little bit more, mimicking the frail, confused old man he desperately needed me to be. I slowly lowered myself into the wooden chair next to him, letting out a pained grunt as my arthritic knees bent. I reached out and placed a gentle, shaking hand on his shoulder. His entire body was tense, vibrating with the effort of maintaining his theatrical sobbing. It is going to be all right, Brad, I whispered, infusing my voice with a thick layer of grandfatherly warmth and profound exhaustion. You should have come to me the moment those terrible men threatened you. We are family, and family protects each other. I will not let anything happen to little Leo, or to Monica. If selling a piece of this old farm is what it takes to clear your name and keep you all safe, then that is exactly what we will do. Brad stopped crying almost immediately. The transformation was so abrupt, it was almost comical. He kept his head bowed for another few seconds, letting out one final shuddering sigh before looking up at me. His eyes were red, but the absolute panic that had gripped him just minutes ago was completely gone. In its place was a sickening wash of profound relief, masking a deep, arrogant triumph. He really thought he had pulled it off. He thought his masterclass in emotional manipulation had blinded me to the glaring holes in his ridiculous story. "Thank you, Dad," he choked out, his voice thick with fake gratitude. "You have no idea what this means to me. I promise you, as soon as this nightmare is over, I will make everything right. I will pay you back every single penny from the sale. We will get you the best care possible right here at home. You will never have to worry about a thing." I offered him a weak, trembling smile and patted his shoulder again. "I know you will, son," I murmured softly. "I know you only want what is best for me. So what do we do next? How do we handle these terrible people?" Brad eagerly pushed himself off the floor, careful to avoid the sharp ceramic shards. He grabbed a paper towel from the counter and hastily wiped the spilled coffee from his expensive leather slippers. "The buyer is already lined up," he explained, his tone shifting rapidly from a weeping victim back to a brisk, efficient businessman. "I have a notary public waiting in the city. If you are up for it, I can have him drive out here first thing tomorrow morning. We can sign the deed transfer for the 10 acres right here at this table. Once the paperwork is finalized, the funds will be released, and I can pay off the syndicate by tomorrow night." I nodded slowly, letting my gaze wander around the kitchen as if I were slightly overwhelmed by the pace of his words. "Tomorrow morning," I repeated, letting my voice waver. "Yes, I suppose that will be fine. Just make sure the papers clearly state it is only the 10 acres by the old creek. I do not want any mistakes with the property lines. I want to make sure the rest of the farm stays exactly as it is." Brad smiled, a wide, reassuring expression that made my stomach turn. "Absolutely, Dad. Just the 10 acres. I will personally review every single line of the contract before you sign it. You have my word." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, playing the part of an exhausted elder who had simply had enough excitement for one day. "I think I need to rest now, Brad. This has been a very difficult morning. Why do you not go upstairs and check on Monica? Tell her the good news. Tell her everything is going to be perfectly fine." Brad practically beamed. He nodded eagerly, stepping backward toward the doorway. "I will do that right now, Dad. Thank you so much. You are truly saving our lives today." He turned immediately and walked right out of the kitchen. I kept my eyes closed, listening carefully to his rapid footsteps on the wooden staircase. I waited patiently until the heavy guest bedroom door finally clicked shut. The house fell completely silent once more. Slowly, I opened my eyes. The trembling in my hands stopped completely. The confused posture vanished, replaced by the rigid bearing of a man preparing for war. I reached under the table. My fingers found the tape I had placed there this morning. Beside it was the micro-audio recorder. I pressed the button. The recording stopped. I pulled the device free and slipped it into my pocket. Brad thought he had won. He thought he was walking upstairs to celebrate his victory. He did not realize he had just given me a clear audio confession. I slipped the small black device into my heavy flannel pocket, feeling the cold plastic against my fingers. It was the only tangible proof I had of the absolute monster my son had become. I walked out of the kitchen and met Brad at the bottom of the staircase. He had already changed into a fresh, neatly pressed dress shirt, looking completely revitalized by the lie he thought I had swallowed. I offered him a weak, tired smile and leaned heavily against the wooden banister. I told him I needed to head into town for my scheduled arthritis checkup. I explained that the bitter cold weather was making my joints ache more than usual, and I needed the clinic to refill my prescription before the snowstorm hit. He did not question it for a single second. He just nodded eagerly, offering to help me warm up the car, playing the role of the dutiful son to perfection. I declined his help, grabbing my worn leather coat from the rack. I walked out into the freezing morning air, my boots crunching loudly against the fresh snow. My trusty Ford pickup was parked near the barn, covered in a thin layer of frost. The engine roared to life with a familiar, comforting rumble. As I backed out of the long gravel driveway, I looked through the rearview mirror. Brad was standing by the front window watching me leave, probably mentally spending the millions he thought he had just secured. I did not drive to the local medical clinic. I drove right past it, taking the long highway that led straight into the heart of the city. 45 minutes later, I pulled my dusty, battered truck into the pristine underground parking garage of a sleek glass high-rise. This was the home of a premier estate law firm. More importantly, it was the office of Thomas Vance, my personal attorney and a man I had known for nearly 50 years. Thomas and I served together in the Marine Corps. He was a former judge, advocate, general officer, a man whose mind was as sharp and unforgiving as a steel trap. I rode the private elevator up to the 20th floor, bypassing the cheerful receptionist, and walked directly into his spacious corner office. Thomas looked up from his heavy mahogany desk. He saw the cold, rigid set of my jaw and immediately knew this was not a social visit. We did not waste time with pleasantries. I sat down in the leather chair opposite him, pulled the micro-audio recorder from my pocket, and set it firmly on the desk. I told him everything. I laid out the forged medical documents, the offshore wire transfers, the lockdown memory care facility, and the elaborate, tearful story Brad had spun about a violent underground syndicate threatening to murder his family. Thomas listened in absolute stony silence. When I finished, he simply nodded, picked up his desk phone, and summoned his senior forensic accountant into the room. We quickly turned his elegant office into a makeshift war room. The forensic accountant, a sharp young woman with a talent for unearthing buried secrets, connected her secure laptop to the large monitor on the wall. I handed over the corporate registry numbers I had obtained from my private investigator the night before. We began to systematically dissect the financial anatomy of his primary limited liability company. It took less than an hour for the intricate, deceitful facade he had created to completely unravel right before my eyes. There were no mysterious private lenders. There was no ruthless underground mob threatening to break into his house. The terrifying syndicate that Brad had wept about on my kitchen floor simply did not exist. Instead, the screen illuminated a pathetic, spiraling paper trail of catastrophic personal choices. Brad had leveraged everything he owned to chase high-risk speculative investments that had violently crashed. When his legitimate funding dried up, he began siphoning money from his own clients to cover his massive margin calls. But the most sickening discovery was the sheer volume of his gambling debts. The records showed hundreds of thousands of dollars wired to offshore sports betting platforms and elite unregulated online casinos. He was not a desperate father trying to protect his wife and his autistic child from violent criminals. He was a degenerate, out-of-control gambler who was systematically stealing from everyone around him to feed a bottomless, destructive addiction. The sheer audacity of his lie was almost hard to process. He had looked me dead in the eye, invoked the safety of my helpless grandson, and manufactured a life-or-death scenario just to manipulate my emotions. He knew I would never hand over the family farm to cover his gambling losses, so he invented a phantom cartel. The 10 acres he pleaded for earlier that morning was just the tip of a massive, poisonous iceberg. Thomas leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers as he stared at the financial wreckage displayed on the monitor. He told me that Brad was drowning in over $8 million of debt, and the federal regulators were already circling his firm. It was only a matter of weeks before the authorities moved in and froze all of his assets. That was the real reason he was so desperate to get his hands on my estate. He needed a massive, untraceable influx of cash to replace the client funds he had stolen before the federal auditors arrived. My farm was his ultimate escape hatch. I sat quietly, absorbing the absolute ruin of the boy I had raised. Any lingering shred of paternal hesitation evaporated into the cold, sterile air of the law office. I looked across the desk at Thomas, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any emotion. I told him we needed to dig much deeper into his recent real estate transactions to uncover his final intent right away, this very morning, without a doubt. Thomas nodded solemnly at my request. He turned his attention back to the sharp young forensic accountant sitting beside him. We need to look at any pending contracts. Letters of intent or preliminary agreements tied to this property address, he instructed her, his voice low and serious. Do not just look in the local county registry. Search the corporate databases. Look for non-disclosure agreements or shell companies negotiating land acquisitions in the Hudson Valley area. She adjusted her glasses and let her fingers fly across the keyboard. The mechanical clicking filled the quiet office for several agonizing minutes. I sat perfectly still, listening to the hum of the ventilation system, feeling a cold dread settling deep into my bones. I knew Brad was lying about the 10 acres, but I needed to know exactly how deep his betrayal ran. Suddenly the typing stopped. The young woman leaned closer to her glowing screen, her eyes widening slightly behind her wire-rimmed glasses. I found something, she murmured, her voice tight with disbelief. It is buried under 3 layers of corporate shielding tied to a limited liability company that Brad registered just 6 weeks ago. She pressed a few keys, and a heavily redacted document appeared on the large monitor mounted on the wall. It was a drafted, unsigned contract of sale. Thomas stood up and walked closer to the screen, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. His jaw clenched tighter with every line he read. This is not a local buyer, Richard, Thomas said, his tone turning incredibly grim. And this is most certainly not an agreement for 10 acres by the old creek. He tapped the screen with his pen, highlighting the name of the purchasing entity. It was Oratech. Even living out on a farm, I knew that name. They were a massive Silicon Valley technology giant famous for building sprawling high-security data centers across the country. They needed massive plots of land proximity to major water sources for cooling their servers and access to the main power grids. My farm checked every single one of those boxes perfectly. Scroll down to the property description and the purchase price, I told the accountant, my voice unnervingly calm. She scrolled down the digital document. There it was, spelled out in stark black and white. Brad wasn't trying to sell a small, useless corner of my land to pay off a phantom mob. He had negotiated the sale of the entire 600-acre farm. Every single pasture, the historic barn, the forests, and the house I had built with my own 2 hands. He was selling my entire legacy, and the agreed-upon purchase price sitting at the bottom of the page was a staggering $25 million. The sheer scale of the betrayal struck me like a physical blow to the chest. $25 million. It was a sum of money so large it defied comprehension, but it perfectly explained the elaborate sociopathic lengths my son was willing to go to. Everything suddenly snapped into crystal clear focus. The puzzle pieces locked together, forming a horrifying picture of absolute greed. Thomas walked slowly back to his desk and sat down heavily. Do you see what he is doing, Richard? He asked softly. If he simply asked you to sell, you would refuse. If he forged a deed for the whole farm, the bank and the title company would require massive verification, and you would easily catch him. But if he has a prominent neurologist declare you legally incompetent due to severe advanced dementia, the entire game changes. He pointed to the forged medical power of attorney we had placed on the desk earlier. With that document and Dr. Thorne's fraudulent medical evaluation, Brad petitions the state to become your permanent legal guardian. Once a judge grants him that power, you lose all your civil rights. You cannot sign a contract, you cannot hire a lawyer, and you cannot manage your own bank accounts. Brad becomes the sole decision-maker for your estate. He would sign the Oratech contract on my behalf, I said, finishing his thought. Exactly. Thomas confirmed, his face pale with suppressed anger. He signs the $25 million deal. The money goes into a trust that he completely controls as your guardian. He pays off his $8 million in gambling debts, hides the rest in offshore accounts, and lives like a king. And what happens to me, I asked, though I already knew the chilling answer. Thomas looked down at his desk. You go to Pine Haven. He locks you in a windowless room in a grim, underfunded lockdown facility 300 miles away. Nobody will listen to your complaints because you are officially a diagnosed dementia patient. If you try to tell the nurses your son stole $25 million and your farm, they will just shake their heads, adjust your medication, and write it down as a symptom of your declining cognitive state. You would spend the rest of your life rotting in that place, entirely forgotten by the world, while he dances on the ashes of your legacy. The silence in the room became absolute. I stared at the $25 million figure glowing on the monitor. Brad had looked me in the eyes, cried real tears on my kitchen floor, and begged for my help, all while holding the shovel he planned to use to bury me alive. He was going to erase my existence to fund his gambling addiction. The pain in my chest, the lingering grief of a father losing his son, finally burned away completely. There was no more sadness left inside me. There was only the cold, hard resolve of a soldier who had just realized he was completely surrounded by enemy forces. Print every single page of that contract. I told the accountant, my voice steady and hard. I turned to my oldest friend. Thomas, we strike now. I left Thomas sitting at his large mahogany desk, surrounded by the undeniable digital proof of my son's ultimate betrayal. I promised my oldest friend that I would call him later that evening to finalize our strategy. I walked out of the law office, stepped into the private elevator, and descended into the cold, silent depths of the underground parking garage. The concrete walls echoed with the sound of my heavy leather boots. The reality of the $25 million Oratech contract sat like a block of solid ice in the very center of my chest. I unlocked my dusty Ford pickup truck and climbed into the driver's seat. The cabin was freezing, but I did not turn the key in the ignition. I just sat there, in the dim artificial light of the garage, breathing heavily, trying to process the magnitude of the greed that had completely consumed my family. Before I left the farmhouse that morning, I had made one final tactical decision. The small micro-recorder I had retrieved from under the dining room table was not the only listening device I possessed. Decades in military intelligence teach you the absolute necessity of redundancy. While Brad was upstairs celebrating his fabricated victory with Monica, I had carefully slipped a second voice-activated digital transmitter behind the large flour canister on the kitchen counter. It was directly connected to a secure application on my cellular phone. I reached into my heavy coat pocket, pulled out the phone, and connected a pair of wired earphones. I needed to know exactly what happened in my home the moment they thought the old gullible farmer was safely out of the picture. I opened the application and found the audio file time-stamped just 5 minutes after my truck had pulled out of the snowy driveway. I tapped the play button and leaned my head back against the headrest. At first, there was only the faint, familiar hum of the kitchen refrigerator. Then I heard the heavy thud of the front door closing. Footsteps echoed sharply on the terracotta tiles. Brad and Monica were walking into the kitchen. I could hear the distinct sound of a glass bottle being uncorked and liquid pouring into crystal glasses. They were drinking my expensive wine before noon. Well, that was certainly easier than I expected, Brad said, his voice completely devoid of the tearful desperation he had weaponized just an hour earlier. He let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. I told you, Monica. I told you he would completely fold the second I brought Leo into the conversation. The old man is so ridiculously predictable. He practically tripped over himself trying to hand over the rights to the property. A sharp clinking of glasses followed. Monica sighed, a sound of profound relief mixed with dripping condescension. Thank God, she replied smoothly. I honestly thought we were going to have to drag this out in court for months. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to constantly pretend to care about him? The way he talks, the way he smells like horses and cheap soap. It makes my skin crawl. We just need to keep him docile for a few more days until the notary public finalizes the Oratech contract. I sat perfectly still in the freezing truck, listening to my own son chuckle at his wife's cruel disgust for me. But the betrayal was about to reach a depth I had not even begun to fathom. So what is the exact timeline for the payout? Monica asked, the raw greed bleeding through the audio feed. Brad swallowed his wine loudly. Oratek is eager to break ground before the spring thaw. Once I have the legal guardianship paperwork stamped and the sale finalized, the $25 million gets wired directly into the new holding account. We pay off the debts, and the rest is completely ours. Pine Haven is ready to take him by the end of next week. We just drop him off, sign the admission forms, and walk away. He will be locked in the dementia ward. By the time he realizes what actually happened, we will be drinking champagne on a flight to Europe. I felt my jaw clench so tightly, my teeth began to ache. But then Monica spoke again, and her words stopped my heart completely. "And what about Leo?" she asked coldly. There was a brief pause on the recording. Brad sounded slightly hesitant. "What do you mean?" "He comes with us, obviously. We can hire a private tutor for him once we settle in." "Absolutely not." Monica snapped, her voice turning into a vicious, hateful hiss. "I am not doing it, Brad. I am not spending the best years of my life with all that money playing nursemaid. Once we get the $25 million, dump the old man at Pine Haven and send Leo to that special education boarding school in Oregon, the one that takes them year-round." Brad let out a nervous breath. "Monica, he is my son. He just needs a little extra help." "He is a burden," she interrupted viciously. "I am not dragging a fat, retarded kid to our new villa in Tuscany. Do you understand me? He ruins every dinner, he cannot look anyone in the eye, and he is an absolute embarrassment to be around. We are starting over, a clean slate. We drop the old man in the asylum. We ship the defective kid across the country, and we finally live the life we actually deserve. If you try to bring him with us, I will divorce you and take half the money anyway." The audio file ended, leaving only the sound of static hissing in my ears. I pulled the earphones out, my hands trembling. Not with age, not with confusion, with pure, blinding rage. They were planning to throw away my innocent grandson like garbage. I was going to destroy their entire lives without mercy. The hissing static from the earphones seemed to echo endlessly in the cramped, freezing cabin of my Ford pickup truck. I pulled the small white plastic buds from my ears and dropped them onto the passenger seat, my hands trembling so violently that I could barely unclench my calloused fists. I stared blindly through the frost-covered windshield at the cracked concrete wall of the underground parking garage, but I did not see the gray stone. All I saw was the face of my grandson. Little Leo, with his bright, constantly wandering eyes and his beautifully quiet, incredibly gentle soul. The boy who loved the smell of the fresh pine trees on the farm, who would sit for hours on an overturned wooden bucket, just watching the draft horses graze, completely content in his own peaceful, brilliantly silent world. The boy they had just casually called a burden, a defective kid, an absolute embarrassment. Taking my land was an act of profound greed. Forging my name to lock me in a sterile facility for dementia patients was a crime of cold-blooded malice. I accepted those facts upstairs in the lawyer's office minutes ago. I braced myself for the reality that the son I raised was a thief and a pathological liar. I thought I had felt the absolute bottom of the emotional abyss, but I was entirely wrong. The darkness in their hearts went so much deeper than I ever could have possibly imagined. Stealing a fortune from an old man whose life was mostly behind him was one thing, but conspiring to throw away an innocent 10-year-old child, their very own flesh and blood, just to avoid caring for him while they lived in stolen luxury, was a level of concentrated evil I could barely comprehend. Leo did not understand their cruelty at all. He did not know how to defend himself against their venomous hatred. He trusted them implicitly, simply because they were his parents. He was entirely vulnerable, entirely at their mercy, and they were planning to dump him in an institution across the country, the exact moment the ink dried on the Oratek contract. They were going to sever him from the only place he felt truly safe, away from the grandfather who loved him, all for the sake of a European vacation and a clean slate. I bowed my head until my forehead rested heavily against the cold plastic of the steering wheel. I closed my eyes, tightly shutting out the dim light of the garage, and for exactly 60 seconds I allowed myself to break. I wept. Not for the impending loss of my $18 million estate, and certainly not for the terrifying prospect of the lockdown memory care facility they had maliciously chosen for me. I wept for the tragic, agonizing death of my family. I cried for the sweet little boy Brad used to be, who rode high on my shoulders, pretending we were exploring the wild frontier. I mourned the absolute destruction of every hope I held for my legacy. The sheer grief was a heavy physical weight, violently crushing the breath right out of my lungs, tearing fiercely through my chest with jagged, unforgiving claws. The tears felt hot and incredibly bitter against my weathered cheeks, falling silently into the dark, thick fabric of my heavy winter coat. I let the sorrow wash over me completely, fully surrendering to the devastating agony of a broken father who realizes he has inadvertently raised a heartless monster. And then, right as the glowing green digital clock on the dashboard calmly ticked to the very next minute, the tears abruptly stopped. Just like that. The deep well of sorrow simply ran completely dry, leaving behind a vast, desolate, frozen desert of pure, unadulterated resolve. I slowly lifted my head from the steering wheel. I reached up and methodically wiped the lingering moisture from my face with the rough back of my hand. The violent trembling in my fingers ceased entirely. My breathing rapidly slowed, evening out into deep, carefully measured rhythms. The exhausted, heartbroken 79-year-old farmer who had walked into that parking garage was gone. He had died right there in that driver's seat, murdered by the recorded venomous voices of his own son and daughter-in-law. In his place, a much older, much more dangerous version of myself woke up from a very long slumber. The United States Marine. The man who had survived hostile jungles and deadly ambushes, the man who knew exactly how to identify a severe threat and neutralize it with absolute uncompromising prejudice. I looked at my reflection in the small rearview mirror. My eyes were hard flat and entirely void of mercy. Brad and Monica had vastly underestimated their enemy. They thought they were dealing with a senile old fool they could easily manipulate with fake tears and false promises. They thought they had secured their $25 million prize and happily discarded their unwanted burdens, but they had forgotten who actually held the property deed. They had forgotten who truly owned the battlefield. I was not going to simply call the bank and block the fraudulent sale. I was going to let them proudly walk right up to the very edge of their glorious victory, and then I was going to push them violently off the cliff. I picked up my smartphone from the center console. I bypassed the recent call list and precisely dialed the secure number of my private investigator in Chicago. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert, instantly sensing the dramatic shift in my demeanor. I did not bother with pleasantries. I spoke with the calm, terrifying precision of an officer issuing a final order. "Listen to me carefully," I said, the words cutting through the freezing air like broken glass. "I need a wiretap, and I need the personal cell number of the chief executive officer of Oratech." The private investigator did not ask any questions. He simply promised to have the information secured within the hour. I ended the call, turned the key in the ignition, and drove back to the farm. I spent the rest of the evening mentally preparing for the performance of a lifetime. By the time the morning sun crested over the snow-covered hills, I was ready. At precisely 9 o'clock, Brad's luxury SUV pulled up to the farmhouse. He stepped out wearing a sharp suit and a confident smile, completely unaware of the trap closing around him. Monica followed close behind, wrapped in a thick designer coat. Her eyes practically darted around the property, already calculating the square footage and the incoming millions. But they were not alone. A third person stepped out of the back seat. He was a younger man dressed in a cheap, ill-fitting suit, carrying a bulky leather briefcase. Brad introduced him as Mr. Peterson, an official notary public sent from the city to expedite the transfer of the 10 acres. But I had spent 30 years reading people. The man's posture was entirely wrong. His eyes lacked the bored, methodical focus of a true legal professional. He was nervous, shifting his weight constantly. He was a hired actor, just another piece of Brad's elaborate, pathetic theater. I welcomed them inside, shuffling my feet across the floorboards to mimic a slow, painful gait. We gathered around the large oak dining table, the exact same spot where Brad had wept his fake tears the previous morning. The fake notary opened his briefcase and laid out a thick stack of legal documents. I noticed the Oratech logo had been carefully redacted from the headers, replaced by a generic, meaningless corporate name. Monica stood directly behind Brad, leaning over his shoulder. She could barely conceal the absolute hunger radiating from her face. Her eyes were fixed on the bottom line of the signature page, practically drooling with raw, unfiltered greed. She was already mentally spending the $25 million. I slowly sat down in my chair, letting my hands tremble violently as I reached for the reading glasses in my breast pocket. I fumbled with them intentionally, dropping them onto the wooden table with a loud clatter. Brad sighed heavily, an exaggerated display of extreme patience, and gently placed the glasses into my shaking hands. He pointed to the thick stack of papers. "Here we go, Dad," he said smoothly, tapping the signature line with an expensive gold pen. "Just a few standard signatures right here, and the 10 acres will be officially transferred. The syndicate will be paid off by tomorrow, and Leo will be completely safe. All of this stress will be entirely behind us." I picked up the pen. I held it with a loose, uncoordinated grip, letting the tip hover just an inch above the crisp white paper. Then I looked up at Brad, my eyes wide and perfectly vacant. "Who did you say is buying the tractor?" "Brad," I asked, pitching my voice to sound thin and genuinely bewildered. Brad blinked, his confident smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. "Not the tractor, Dad," he corrected softly, exchanging a quick, triumphant glance with Monica. "The 10 acres, for the private buyer. Remember what we talked about yesterday morning?" I stared at him blankly for a long, uncomfortable moment. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at Monica. "Oh, Margaret," I said, using the name of my late sister. "I did not know you were visiting. When did you get here from Ohio?" Monica stiffened, her face twisting with an ugly mixture of deep disgust and sheer impatience. She looked at Brad silently, urging him to hurry the process along. "It is Monica, Dad." Brad sighed, leaning closer to me. "Your daughter-in-law. Margaret passed away 10 years ago." I shook my head slowly, letting my lower lip tremble. "Margaret always hated the winter," I mumbled incoherently. I looked back down at the dense legal documents, squinting hard through my glasses. "Who did you say is buying the tractor, Brad?" I asked again, my voice wavering perfectly. The fake notary shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking at Brad for guidance. Brad placed a firm, steadying hand on my shoulder. "No one is buying a tractor, Dad. We are selling a small piece of the land to pay off a debt. Just sign right where my finger is pointing." I gripped the gold pen tighter, letting my knuckles turn white, but I did not let the tip touch the paper. I looked up at the ceiling, pretending to search my broken memory for an answer that was not there. "But what about the tractor?" I asked for the third time, my tone fragile and painfully confused. "Who is going to plow the lower fields if we sell the machinery today?" Brad let out a short, quiet breath of amusement. He could not completely hide the smug, victorious smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth. He genuinely believed that my mind was completely gone. He thought the dementia was finally taking full control, making me the perfect, helpless victim for his devastating financial slaughter. He leaned in very close, speaking to me with the slow, condescending tone one might use with a very small, unintelligent child. "It is okay, Dad. I will take care of the tractor. I will take care of absolutely everything. All you have to do is write your name on this line right now, and you can go right back to sleep." I looked at him, letting my eyes glaze over with artificial trust. He had no idea that behind this vacant stare my mind was sharper than it had ever been. He had no idea that every single word he spoke was simply adding another thick layer of concrete to his own impending prison sentence. I was not the helpless victim in this room. He was. I took a deep, slow, rattling breath, letting the very heavy gold pen hover just a single millimeter above the crisp, white surface of the final signature page. The silence in the dining room was absolute and suffocating. I could hear the rapid breathing of my daughter-in-law standing directly behind Brad. She was vibrating with anticipation, her knuckles white gripping the chair. Beside me, the fake notary wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, eager to collect his illegal fee. Brad kept his finger planted next to the dotted line, his eyes tracking the pen. He was incredibly close to stealing my entire life. But he had failed to account for the large ceramic mug of scalding hot black coffee sitting near my right elbow, a fresh cup I asked him to pour just moments before. I let the pen touch the paper. Brad leaned in closer. And then I executed the maneuver. It was a masterpiece of physical acting, honed by years of observing the frailty of older men. I forced a sudden spasm through my right shoulder, letting the tremor travel down my arm. My elbow jerked outward, colliding heavily with the heavy ceramic mug. The impact was perfectly angled. The mug tipped over violently, sending a tidal wave of dark coffee rushing directly across the oak table. It completely flooded the thick stack of legal documents. The scalding liquid soaked instantly into the thick, porous paper, washing over the carefully hidden clauses, destroying the fake corporate seals, and completely obliterating the signature lines. No, Brad screamed, his voice shattering the quiet farmhouse. It was a raw sound of pure panic. His carefully constructed mask disintegrated. He desperately lunged forward, clawing frantically at the soaked papers, trying in vain to lift them away from the rapidly spreading dark puddle. But it was far too late. The cheap ink from the fake notary seal was already bleeding into massive purple smears. Monica let out a horrified shriek, jumping back as hot coffee dripped off the table edge. "What did you do?" Brad yelled, his face turning crimson. He glared down at me with absolute, undisguised hatred. "The highly sensitive legal documents are completely and utterly ruined now." I shrank back into my chair, bringing both hands to my chest. I let my eyes widen in genuine-looking horror and began to apologize profusely, my voice trembling with manufactured fear. "I am so sorry, Brad," I whimpered, staring at the mess. My hand just jerked. I could not stop it. "I am so clumsy today. Please do not be angry with me. I did not mean to ruin the papers for the tractor." Brad stood there, breathing heavily, his fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles looked like bone. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might actually strike me. But he remembered the hired actor standing awkwardly on the other side. He took a deep, shuddering breath, violently wrestling his temper back under control. He closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. "It is absolutely fine, Dad," he choked out, his voice vibrating intensely with barely contained violent rage. "It was just an accident." He turned his furious gaze to the notary. "Do you have another copy in your briefcase?" he demanded. "Pull it out so we can get this over with." The young, inexperienced actor looked absolutely terrified by the sudden outburst. He nervously clutched his bag and shook his head. "No, sir," he stammered. "Those were the only original copies drawn up. I cannot legally notarize stained or illegible pages. The clerk will reject them immediately. You have to get fresh documents printed and verified at the city office before we can proceed." Brad swore very loudly, violently slamming his open palm against the edge of the wooden table. The sound made Monica flinch. He looked down at the soggy mess representing his $25 million salvation. Because the Oratech contract was hidden behind layers of shell companies, he could not simply print them off a home computer. He had to go all the way back to the city, personally deal with his corrupt corporate lawyers, and have a completely new set of fraudulent documents professionally prepared from scratch. "How long is that going to take?" Monica hissed, grabbing Brad by the sleeve. Her perfectly manicured nails dug fiercely into the expensive fabric of his suit. "We do not have time for this absolute nonsense." He shot her a warning glare, silently telling her to shut up. "It means we have to drive all the way back to Manhattan," he said through gritted teeth. "We have to get the lawyers to draft a new master copy and rebind the entire package. We will not be back here until the day after tomorrow." He turned back to me, forcing a stiff smile. "I will be back on Thursday morning, Dad. We will try this again then. Just get some rest. I will handle the tractor issue. Everything is going to be perfectly fine. You just need to trust me like you always have." I nodded meekly, keeping my head bowed as they angrily packed up their ruined papers and stormed out of the house. The heavy door slammed shut, and a minute later their vehicle went tearing down the driveway. I stood up from the wooden dining table, my tired posture instantly straightening, the fake trembling completely gone from my calloused hands. I grabbed a dry towel and calmly began wiping up the spilled coffee. The clumsy accident worked flawlessly. Brad and Monica were speeding back to the city, fuming with frustration, entirely convinced they had been thwarted by the clumsiness of a senile old man. They had no idea that I had just deliberately bought myself exactly 48 critical hours of absolute freedom. And 48 hours was all the time a seasoned military veteran needed to systematically dismantle their entire future and burn their stolen empire straight to the ground. I watched dust settle on the driveway. The farmhouse fell into a deep silence. I picked up the ruined documents and tossed them into the fireplace. The flames quickly turned the fraudulent ink into ash. I checked my pocket watch. It was exactly 10 o'clock. Right on time. A low hum broke the morning air. I looked out the window and saw a sleek black luxury SUV making its way up my driveway. The vehicle came to a smooth halt near the red barn. The driver's side door opened, and a tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out into the winter chill. He possessed the calculating posture of a man accustomed to commanding every room. This was Jonathan Vance, the chief executive officer of Oratech. I had called him directly the previous afternoon, bypassing his army of receptionists. I told him exactly enough to pique his interest. I told him the land acquisition his company was pursuing was built entirely on federal wire fraud. If he wanted the land, he had to come speak to the actual owner in person. I stepped out onto the porch. He looked up, evaluating me instantly. He did not see a frail, confused old man. He saw a man standing tall, waiting for him with absolute authority. "Mr. Dawson," he said, climbing the wooden steps, "your phone call yesterday was highly unorthodox. My legal team strongly advised against me driving up here without them." I shook his hand firmly. "Your legal team is about to owe me a massive debt of gratitude, Mr. Vance," I replied calmly. "Please come inside. We have business to discuss, and not much time." I led him into the kitchen and offered him a seat at the exact same oak table where my son had just thrown his tantrum. I poured him a cup of coffee. He sat down, looking around the rustic room. He was a man of logic, trying to figure out how a simple farmer fit into his corporate expansion. "Let us get straight to the point," Jonathan said. "Your son has presented us with a legally binding letter of intent to sell this 600-acre property. He provided documentation stating he holds the medical power of attorney and is finalizing a petition for absolute legal guardianship over your estate. He assured us your cognitive decline was severe." I reached into my leather satchel and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I slid it across the table toward him. "I highly recommend you read the contents of that envelope before your company wires $25 million to a degenerate gambler." Jonathan opened the envelope. Inside was a certified copy of the actual property deed, firmly establishing me as the sole owner of the farm. Beneath that was a signed affidavit from my personal attorney, completely refuting any claims of my mental incompetence. The final piece of paper was the most damning. It was the financial background check my investigator ran on Brad, detailing his $8 million in outstanding offshore gambling debts and the impending federal audit of his investment firm. Jonathan read through the documents in absolute silence. His expression remained stoic, but I saw the subtle tightening of his jaw. He was a man who hated being lied to, and he was realizing just how close his massive corporation had come to stepping into a catastrophic legal minefield. Bradley does not own a single blade of grass on this property, I explained very calmly. The medical evaluation he showed your lawyers was purchased for $100,000 from a corrupt neurologist. The power of attorney was forged. If you sign that contract with him, it will be contested in federal court. Your company will be tied up in litigation for years, your data center will never be built, and you will lose millions in legal fees. Jonathan slowly placed the papers back onto the table. He looked at me, a newfound respect flashing in his sharp eyes. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. You did not invite me all the way out here simply to warn me, Richard. If you just wanted to stop the sale, your lawyer could have sent a cease and desist order. You want something else. I nodded, appreciating his sharp intellect. You need this land for your new servers. It sits directly on the primary water table and connects straight to the main power grid. I know it is the perfect location for you. I am willing to give you the land, but I am not going to sell it. I am going to lease it to Oratech on a 99-year commercial agreement. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. A lease. It works perfectly for both of us, I continued. You get the exact property you need without spending $25 million in upfront capital. The monthly lease payments will go directly into an irrevocable trust that I am establishing this afternoon. The sole beneficiary of that trust will be my 10-year-old autistic grandson. Bradley will never be able to touch a single penny of it. Jonathan tapped his finger thoughtfully against his coffee mug. It is a highly irregular arrangement for a project of this scale, but from a financial standpoint, a long-term lease is incredibly advantageous for our quarterly balance sheets. However, I sense there is a condition attached to this generous offer. You are a very smart man, I said softly, leaning closer across the table. I will sign the 99-year lease agreement with you tomorrow. But on Thursday morning, when my son brings you the finalized fraudulent documents for the sale, you are going to play along. You are going to help me back him into a corner he can never escape from. Jonathan Vance looked at me for a long time. Then a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He extended his hand across the table. You have yourself a deal. I released Jonathan Vance's hand. The firm handshake sealed a pact that would alter the trajectory of my family's history. He did not linger. Men of his stature rarely did. He walked back to his black luxury vehicle, the tires crunching softly against the gravel as he drove away, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the winter wind. I did not waste a single second. I walked to the wall telephone and dialed my attorney. Thomas answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and expectant. I told him Oratech was fully on board and ready to participate in our trap. I told him we had exactly 24 hours to build the legal fortress. Thomas instructed me to be at his office at the crack of dawn the following morning. The rest of the day passed in a surreal blur of absolute focus. I walked the perimeter of the farm, looking at the rolling hills, the dense forests, and the old barn. I was not saying goodbye to my land. I was making sure it would survive long after I was gone safely out of the greedy hands of the son who thought he could simply steal it. Early Wednesday morning, I found myself sitting once again in the heavy leather chair across from Thomas. The polished mahogany desk was covered with a mountain of crisp, perfectly drafted legal documents. They looked very different from the cheap, fraudulent papers Brad had brought to my dining room. These were bound in thick blue folders stamped with legitimate state seals and prepared by a former military judge who knew how to wage a war using contracts and clauses. Thomas folded his hands over the largest stack of papers and looked me dead in the eye. He wanted to make absolutely certain I understood the gravity of what we were about to do. "Richard," he said quietly, his tone completely professional, but laced with deep respect. "Once you sign these documents, there is no turning back. You are establishing an irrevocable trust. The key word is irrevocable. You cannot change your mind next year. You cannot dissolve it if Brad suddenly apologizes. This is a permanent, legally binding transfer of your entire earthly estate. I nodded slowly, my face carved from stone. I do not want a back door, Thomas. I want a vault. Explain the terms to me one last time so I know the boy is protected. Thomas opened the master folder. He pointed to the boldly typed paragraphs. Every single acre of the 600-acre farm, the farmhouse, the livestock, and all of your personal liquid assets are being transferred directly into the Dawson Heritage Trust. Furthermore, the 99-year commercial lease agreement you struck with Oratech is bound directly to this trust. The massive monthly lease payments will funnel straight into this highly secure account. It will generate immense generational wealth. And the sole beneficiary of this entire fortune is your grandson, Leo Dawson. I felt a profound sense of peace wash over my tired soul. For the first time since this nightmare began, I knew the innocent child they planned to throw away would be completely untouchable. But who controls the vault? I asked softly. Thomas tapped the line under my printed name. You do, Richard. You are the sole managing trustee for the remainder of your natural life. You maintain absolute control over the land and the funds, but legally you no longer own them as an individual. Therefore, they cannot be seized, they cannot be sold, and they cannot be stolen by anyone claiming to be your legal guardian. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my favorite pen. It was the same silver pen my late wife had given me on our 30th wedding anniversary. I did not fake a tremor this time. My hand was as steady as a surgeon's blade. I pressed the tip to the paper and signed my name. I signed page after page, initialing every rider and every addendum. With every stroke of the pen, I systematically erased Richard Dawson, the vulnerable property owner, and replaced him with Richard Dawson, the impenetrable trustee. The young forensic accountant we worked with yesterday stood quietly in the corner, serving as our legitimate witness. She notarized every single signature with a heavy, satisfying stamp. When the final page was turned and signed, Thomas gathered the massive stack of papers. He carefully placed them into a fireproof safe behind his desk. It is done, my old friend said softly, leaning back with a look of grim satisfaction. The deed is officially transferred and recorded in the county database as of this exact minute. Your son is chasing a ghost. I walked out of the law office and drove back to the quiet farmhouse. The winter sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the snowy fields. Everything looked exactly the same, but the fundamental reality of the universe had violently shifted. I poured myself a small glass of bourbon and sat by the crackling fireplace. Tomorrow was Thursday. Brad and Monica were currently in the city, undoubtedly celebrating their impending wealth. They were spending thousands of dollars on corrupt lawyers to draw up a fresh batch of fraudulent documents. They were meticulously planning their luxurious European vacation and finalizing the cruel arrangements to lock me in an asylum and abandon Leo in a distant institution. They genuinely believed they held all the cards. They thought the Oratech millions were already resting comfortably in their pockets. They had absolutely no idea that the property they were trying to sell no longer legally existed on the open market. They did not know that their forged medical power of attorney was now completely worthless, reduced to a pathetic piece of trash. Brad was arrogantly strutting toward the finish line, completely blind to the fact that he was actually walking straight into a devastating, explosive minefield. And I was holding the detonator. 2 weeks passed in calm. The winter snow began to melt across the Hudson Valley, but the coldness in my heart remained absolutely frozen. I stayed on the farm, tending the animals, and living exactly as I always had. I did not call my son, and he did not bother calling me. He was too busy orchestrating the final details of his magnificent theft. He genuinely believed he had won. On a crisp Thursday morning, the towering glass monolith of the Oratech headquarters gleamed under the Manhattan sun. It was a monument to wealth piercing the city skyline. At exactly 10 o'clock, a sleek black car pulled up to the private entrance. The rear door opened, and Bradley stepped out onto the pristine pavement. He looked exactly like a man who had just conquered the entire world. He was wearing a brand new custom-tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. His hair was perfectly styled, and his $80,000 rose gold watch caught the morning light. Monica slid out right behind him, wrapped tightly in an extravagant white cashmere coat, carrying an incredibly expensive designer handbag. They walked through the revolving doors of the lobby with their heads held high, radiating an obnoxious, overwhelming arrogance. They did not look at the security guards or acknowledge the reception desk. They glided straight toward the VIP elevator bank, completely intoxicated by the sheer magnitude of their impending $25 million payday. The private elevator shot upward, carrying them smoothly to the 50th floor. The doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a sprawling, ultra-modern reception area. A silent assistant guided them down a long hallway lined with abstract art and frosted glass partitions. They were led directly into the primary executive boardroom. It was a massive, intimidating space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the entire city. In the center of the room sat a long table carved from a single slab of dark walnut. Jonathan Vance, the chief executive officer of Oratech, was already sitting at the head of the table. He was flanked by two men in dark suits who appeared to be senior corporate attorneys. Jonathan stood up smoothly, buttoning his suit jacket, and extended a welcoming hand. Brad took it eagerly, flashing a brilliant, practiced smile. They exchanged pleasantries, the hollow, corporate small talk of men about to execute a massive financial transaction. Monica took her seat next to Brad, crossing her legs elegantly. Her eyes immediately darted toward a silver tray resting on a side credenza. Sitting on the tray was an expensive crystal ice bucket holding a bottle of vintage champagne surrounded by 4 tall fluted glasses. Next to the ice bucket was a thick leather portfolio. She knew exactly what was inside that portfolio. It was the certified corporate bank check for the $10 million non-refundable advance. The money that would clear their debts and buy their freedom. "Let us get right down to business," Jonathan said, taking his seat and folding his hands on the polished wood. "My board of directors is extremely eager to break ground on the new data center. As you know, the environmental surveys and zoning permits have already been expedited. The only remaining hurdle is the legal transfer of the property title. Are all of your documents in perfect order, Bradley?" "Absolutely," Brad replied, his voice oozing with supreme confidence. He reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a beautifully bound stack of legal papers. He slid them carefully across the smooth walnut table toward the chief executive. "These are the finalized documents freshly drawn up by my legal team in the city. Included in that packet is the state-certified medical power of attorney, granting me full and absolute legal guardianship over my father and his entire estate." Jonathan picked up the documents and began to slowly flip through the pages. "I also included the official medical evaluation from Dr. Aris Thorne." Brad continued, projecting a tone of deep manufactured sadness. "It breaks my heart, Jonathan. It truly does. My father was a brilliant man, but the dementia has advanced much faster than any of us could have ever anticipated. He no longer recognizes his own home. He does not even know what year it is. For his own safety and well-being, my wife and I have secured a place for him in a premier lockdown memory care facility. The transition will be difficult, but the sale of this property will ensure he receives the absolute best medical attention available for the rest of his natural life." Monica nodded solemnly, placing a comforting hand over Brad's arm. "It has been a tragic burden on our family," she added softly, her voice perfectly pitched to convey the sorrow of a devoted daughter-in-law. "But we are doing what is necessary." Jonathan Vance kept his face completely devoid of expression. He stared at the forged medical evaluation, his eyes scanning the incredibly expensive lies printed on the heavy cardstock. He knew the truth. He knew exactly what these two vultures were planning to do to an innocent old man and a helpless autistic child. But he played his part with absolute perfection. "Everything appears to be perfectly in order," Jonathan said smoothly, closing the folder and looking up at Brad. He reached inside his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen. He laid it gently on the table. "Once you sign the transfer agreement, the property is officially ours, and the $10 million advance check in that leather portfolio is entirely yours." Brad stared at the silver pen. A victorious grin broke across his face. He was seconds away from the ultimate triumph. He reached his hand forward, his fingers hovering over the pen. He took one deep breath, relishing the power of the moment, and pressed the tip of the pen against the crisp paper. But before a single drop of ink could stain that fraudulent contract, the heavy, solid oak doors of the executive boardroom swung violently open. The sound cracked through the silent, tense air of the room like a thunderclap echoing off the floor to ceiling glass windows. Brad froze. His hand hovered in midair, his fingers gripping the silver fountain pen so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He let out a sharp, irritated breath, clearly annoyed by the sudden interruption to his coronation. He slowly turned his head toward the entrance, an arrogant reprimand already forming on his lips. But the arrogant words died instantly in his throat. I stepped across the threshold and walked right into the center of the massive room. There was no shuffling in my gait. There was no hesitant, painful limp. I did not lean heavily on a wooden cane, nor did I keep my head bowed in the frail, subservient posture of a broken old man suffering from cognitive decline. My shoulders were pulled back, my spine was completely straight, and my chin was held high. I was wearing a meticulously tailored dark navy suit, perfectly pressed and sharply creased. My hands, which had trembled so pathetically just 48 hours earlier, while spilling hot coffee over his fake documents, were now perfectly steady, resting calmly at my sides. I looked directly into my son's eyes, projecting the cold, uncompromising authority of a man who had spent his youth commanding troops in hostile territory. I let him see the absolute absence of confusion or fear in my expression. I watched the realization slowly crawl across his face as he understood that the helpless, senile father he thought he had completely outsmarted was nothing more than an elaborate, perfectly executed illusion. I did not come alone. Walking immediately to my right was Thomas Vance. My oldest friend and personal attorney looked every bit the ruthless legal predator that he truly was. He carried a thick black leather briefcase holding the real irrevocable trust documents and the undeniable proof of my son's federal crimes. But it was the two men walking closely behind us that completely drained the remaining oxygen from the executive boardroom. They were tall, broad-shouldered men wearing identical, unremarkable dark gray suits. They did not carry briefcases. They carried an aura of absolute, uncompromising governmental authority. Their eyes swept the room methodically, assessing every single exit and cataloging every person present. Clipped to their belts, just barely visible beneath their tailored jackets, were their official badges and issued sidearms. They were special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Thomas had made a few highly confidential calls to his former colleagues at the Justice Department the previous afternoon, presenting them with the meticulously documented paper trail of the $8 million offshore gambling debts and the fraudulent corporate wire transfers. The agents had been waiting quietly in a private conference room down the hall for the past hour, perfectly timing their entrance to coincide with the exact moment my son attempted to finalize his massive extortion scheme. The silence in the boardroom stretched into an unbearable eternity. Brad's jaw literally dropped. His mouth opened and closed in rapid succession, desperately trying to form words that his paralyzed brain could not supply. The heavy silver fountain pen slipped from his numb, trembling fingers. It hit the polished walnut table with a sharp, piercing clatter and rolled slowly across the surface. He stared at me as if he were looking at a ghost. He was truly looking at the ghost of the man he had plotted to bury alive in a psychiatric ward. Next to him, Monica stood up from her leather chair in a sudden, jerky motion. Her face, previously flushed with the intoxicating thrill of impending immense wealth, turned the color of old parchment. The incredibly expensive designer handbag she had been clutching onto so proudly slipped right through her fingers. It hit the carpeted floor with a heavy, muffled thud. She did not even blink or look down to retrieve it. She just stared at the two federal agents standing near the doorway, her chest heaving as a deep primal panic finally set in. She knew what those badges meant. She knew that the lavish European vacations and the life of ultimate luxury were completely gone, replaced by the terrifying, stark reality of an impending federal indictment. Jonathan Vance, the chief executive officer of Oratech, remained perfectly still at the head of the table. He did not look surprised, because he and I had successfully orchestrated this exact sequence of events down to the very last second. He simply reached out, picked up the ruined, fraudulent contract, and folded it neatly in half, sliding it entirely out of Brad's reach. Brad finally managed to draw a ragged, shuddering breath. His eyes darted wildly around the room, desperately seeking an explanation, a loophole, or an exit. He looked at Thomas, then at the federal agents, and finally brought his terrified gaze back to me. "Dad." He choked out, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic squeak that echoed miserably across the vast room. "What in the world is going on here? Why are you dressed like that? Who are these people?" I took one slow, deliberate step forward. The sound of my leather shoe connecting with the hardwood floor felt like the strike of a judge's gavel. I did not shout. I did not need to. I spoke in a voice so calm and deeply cold that it completely froze the blood in his veins. "Put the pen down, Bradley," I said, every single syllable ringing with absolute finality. "You are not signing anything today. You do not own the farm. You do not hold my medical power of attorney. And you are certainly not sending me to a lockdown facility. The pathetic little play you directed here is officially over, and the final curtain has just fallen on your entire life." The silence that followed my words was so absolute, it felt as though the oxygen had been completely vacuumed from the room. Brad stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, his brain violently rejecting the reality standing right in front of him. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, rattling gasp escaped. He looked at the federal agents, then at Thomas, and finally back to me. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently it was barely audible. "Dad, you are sick. You do not know what you are saying. You are having a terrible episode. We need to get you home right now." He turned desperately toward Jonathan Vance, holding up his hands in a frantic gesture of appeal. "Jonathan, please," he pleaded. "My father is severely unwell. He wandered away from the farmhouse. We need to call for medical assistance immediately to get him safely back to the facility. He does not understand what is happening here." I did not raise my voice to interrupt his pathetic string of lies. I did not need to. I simply turned my head and looked directly at the chief executive officer of Oratech. "Jonathan," I said calmly, my tone perfectly even and respectful, "I believe it is time to share the additional documentation we discussed." Jonathan Vance nodded once. He did not look at Brad. He reached out and tapped a sequence of buttons on the sleek, computerized console built right into the center of the walnut table. The heavy mechanical blinds on the floor-to-ceiling windows smoothly hummed as they closed, plunging the bright room into a soft, subdued twilight. A large digital projector descended silently from the ceiling. But we were not going to watch a visual presentation today. We were going to listen. Jonathan connected his cellular device to the sophisticated surround sound system of the executive boardroom. "I want you to listen very closely, Bradley," I said, keeping my eyes locked onto his terrified face. "I want you to hear exactly how sick and confused I really am." A soft click echoed from the hidden speakers, followed by the faint, distinct hum of my own kitchen refrigerator. Brad flinched as if he had been physically struck by a heavy object. He recognized the ambient noise immediately. Then the heavy thud of the farmhouse front door closing played loudly over the speakers, followed by the clear sound of footsteps on terracotta tiles. It was the exact recording from the morning he thought he had successfully manipulated me into surrendering the estate. His own voice, completely stripped of all fake desperation and dripping with arrogant victory, suddenly filled the entire boardroom. "Well, that was certainly easier than I expected," the recorded. Brad laughed. "I told you, Monica. I told you he would completely fold the second I brought Leo into the conversation. The old man is so ridiculously predictable. He practically tripped over himself, trying to hand over the rights to the property." Brad shrank back deep into his leather chair, his face turning an ashen, sickly gray. But the true devastation had not even begun. The recording continued to play. Monica's voice echoed through the high-fidelity speakers, her tone cold, calculating, and viciously cruel. "Once we get the 25 million, dump the old man at Pine Haven and send Leo to that special education boarding school in Oregon." The corporate attorneys sitting next to Jonathan visibly stiffened in their seats. Even the hardened federal agents shifted their stances, their expressions immediately hardening into masks of pure, unfiltered disgust. Brad stared blankly at the polished walnut table, completely paralyzed by the horrific echo of his own massive betrayal. But the audio file was still not finished. The speakers projected Monica's final, unforgivable venom directly into the sterile corporate air. "I am not dragging a fat, retarded kid to our new villa in Tuscany. Do you understand me? He ruins every dinner. He cannot look anyone in the eye, and he is an absolute embarrassment to be around." The recording ended with a sharp final click, plunging the boardroom back into a suffocating, deeply judgmental silence. Monica let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. She frantically looked around the room, making panicked eye contact with the disgusted corporate lawyers, the stoic federal agents, and finally, my absolute unforgiving stare. The sophisticated, untouchable facade she had proudly worn for years, completely shattered into a million pieces. She was fully exposed, completely laid bare as a heartless monster, who was perfectly willing to discard her own innocent child for a few pieces of stolen silver. She could not handle the crushing weight of the absolute public humiliation pressing down on her shoulders. A primal, desperate instinct took over her body. She lunged backward, knocking her heavy leather chair to the floor with a loud, violent crash. She did not stop to grab her thick cashmere coat or her incredibly expensive designer bag. She just turned and bolted for the heavy oak doors, desperately trying to escape the room, to escape the terrifying consequences of her own poisonous words. But she did not even make it halfway across the thick carpet. The federal agent standing nearest the entrance simply stepped sideways smoothly, blocking her path with his broad, imposing frame. He did not draw his weapon or raise his hands aggressively. He just stood there like a wall of solid granite. "Where exactly do you think you are going, ma'am?" the agent asked, his voice low, incredibly calm, and entirely devoid of any sympathy. "We are not quite finished here." Monica stumbled backward, her chest heaving heavily as she let out a loud, pathetic sob. She was completely trapped inside the room with nowhere left to run. The elegant world she thought she controlled had just violently collapsed around her. She slowly sank to her knees, right there on the carpet, burying her face in her hands, weeping loudly as her cruel, dark reality finally crumbled into nothing. Brad stared at his wife weeping pathetically on the floor, but he did not make a single move to comfort her. His survival instinct, honed by years of cutthroat corporate trading, kicked into overdrive. He slowly turned his attention back to me, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to salvage whatever tiny fragment of control he thought he had left. He swallowed hard, attempting to smooth out his expression into a mask of forced surrender. "Okay, Dad," he said, his voice shaking, but attempting to sound reasonable. "You made your point. You caught us. The audio was a terrible joke, I swear, but you made your point. We will tear up the contract right now. We will walk away from the Oratech deal, and we will never bother you about the farm again. Just tell these agents to step aside, and we will go home. We can handle this privately, as a family." I looked at him, feeling a profound mixture of disgust and absolute pity. The sheer audacity required to casually brush off a massive extortion plot was completely beyond comprehension. He genuinely believed he could just apologize and return to his luxurious life. He did not understand the gravity of the avalanche that was already crushing him. "You are not walking away from anything, Bradley," I replied, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the boardroom. "Did you honestly believe that when I hired a forensic accountant, we would only look at the documents you brought into my kitchen? When you declare war on a man, you better make sure you cover all of your tracks. We went through every single financial record tied to your name over the last 5 years. Brad's eyes darted nervously toward Thomas Vance, the heavy leather briefcase resting on the table, and then back to me. A new, much deeper layer of fear washed over his pale face. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, taking a very slow step backward. "I am talking about the 14th of October last year," I stated, precisely, watching the remaining color drain completely from his cheeks. "You intercepted the mail and rerouted the bank statements to a hidden post office box. You took the original deed, fabricated duplicate property records, and walked into a private bank in Delaware." I took a step closer to him, closing the distance, my presence dominating the physical space between us. "You sat in an office much like this one," I continued, my tone relentless and punishing. "And you forged my signature on a massive deed of trust. You leveraged my land, bought with 40 years of sweat, to secure a $2 million line of credit. You stole $2 million right out from under me to cover your disastrous margin calls." Brad began to physically shake. He raised his hands, shaking his head frantically. "Dad, please, I was going to pay it back. I just needed liquidity to bridge a gap in the market. I made the interest payments every month. The bank never even knew." Thomas Vance stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. His voice was loud, authoritative, and completely devoid of mercy. "The bank absolutely knows now, Bradley," the former military judge declared. "We notified their fraud department yesterday morning. But the primary issue you face today is not simply the forged signature on the loan documents. The issue is how you moved that stolen capital." Thomas opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of bank routing slips, dropping them heavily onto the polished walnut table. "You did not keep the money in New York," Thomas explained, his words echoing like a hammer striking an anvil. "You immediately wired the $2 million across state lines into 3 offshore accounts to feed your unregulated gambling addiction. You used interstate banking communication networks to execute a fraudulent financial transaction." I watched Brad process the legal terminology. He was a finance executive. He knew exactly what those words meant, and he knew exactly what kind of prison sentence they carried. "That is correct, Brad," I said softly, delivering the final crushing blow. "You did not just commit state-level forgery. By wiring that money across state lines, you committed federal wire fraud. It is a Class C felony under United States federal law. It carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in prison for every single transaction. And according to my accountant, you executed 14 separate wire transfers that week." The absolute reality of his situation finally broke through his thick skull. He was not just losing the farm. He was not just losing his wealth. He was losing the rest of his natural life. He was going to spend decades in a federal prison cell. His knees visibly buckled. He grabbed the edge of the walnut table to keep from collapsing next to his weeping wife. He looked at me, tears streaming down his face, his arrogant corporate persona entirely eradicated. He was nothing more than a terrified criminal staring right into the abyss. "Dad." He wept openly, sobbing, now his chest heaving with violent, ragged gasps. "I am your son. Please, I am your only son. You cannot let them do this to me. I will do anything. I will plead guilty to whatever you want. Just do not let them lock me away. Please, Dad." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man crying in front of me. I felt no joy in this victory. I only felt a cold, hollow emptiness where my love for him used to reside. I slowly turned my back to him, facing the large floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The two federal agents standing near the doorway did not need another invitation. They stepped forward simultaneously, their heavy footsteps crossing the thick carpet with grim purpose. One agent reached out, grabbing Brad firmly by the shoulder, while the other smoothly unclipped the heavy steel handcuffs from his leather belt. The metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs closing around Brad's wrists was the sharpest, most definitive sound I had ever heard. It cut through his pathetic sobbing, echoing against the glass walls of the executive boardroom like a final judge's gavel. The federal agent locked the cuffs tight, securing my son's hands firmly behind his back. Brad's incredibly expensive, custom-tailored charcoal suit instantly wrinkled as his shoulders were forcefully yanked backward. He stumbled, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping against the thick carpet, completely losing whatever remained of his manufactured corporate dignity. He was no longer a high-powered executive brokering a $25 million land acquisition. He was just a broken, terrified criminal, realizing his life was entirely over. He violently twisted his neck, looking over his shoulder at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. His face was a wet, swollen mess of absolute despair. "Dad, please," he screamed, his voice shattering into a hysterical, high-pitched wail. "You cannot let them take me away. I am your son. Please, I am your own flesh and blood. You raised me. You cannot just stand there and watch them do this to me." I did not flinch. I did not offer him a single ounce of comfort. I slowly turned away from the panoramic window and walked right up to him, stopping just inches from his tear-stained face. I looked deep into his eyes, searching for the child I used to carry across the snowy pastures of the Hudson Valley. But that child was completely gone. I spoke with a voice so low and incredibly cold that it made the federal agents pause for a brief second. "My son died a long time ago," I said, pronouncing every single syllable with absolute, terrifying clarity. "You are just a trespasser who tried to steal his face." Brad let out a devastated, breathless gasp, as if I had physically driven a knife straight into his chest. He collapsed forward, his knees hitting the floor, but the federal agent effortlessly hauled him back up to his feet, holding him in a firm, unyielding grip. Across the room, Monica was still kneeling on the floor, desperately trying to shrink away from the catastrophic scene unfolding in front of her. She watched her husband get completely destroyed, her mind desperately trying to construct a narrative where she was merely an innocent bystander. She slowly pushed herself up, her hands shaking violently as she smoothed down her extravagant white cashmere coat. She looked at Thomas Vance, then at the second federal agent, her eyes darting nervously. "I had absolutely nothing to do with the bank loans," Monica stammered, her voice shaking with desperate, manufactured innocence. "I did not sign those papers. Brad did all of that on his own. I am just his wife. I did not know he was stealing money." The second federal agent stepped away from the door and walked directly toward her. He reached to his belt and pulled out a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "You are Monica Dawson," the agent stated, his tone flat and entirely devoid of any emotion. "Yes," she whispered, taking a terrified step backward until her back hit the polished walnut table. "You are under arrest for federal conspiracy to commit wire fraud." The agent continued, grabbing her right arm with a grip of solid iron. "You are also being charged with conspiracy to commit elder abuse and criminal extortion." "No!" Monica shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the glass walls. She began to physically struggle, thrashing her arms wildly, completely abandoning her sophisticated society facade. "You cannot arrest me. I did not do anything wrong. I am a mother. You are making a terrible mistake. Get your hands off me right now." The agent did not argue. He simply twisted her wrist with practiced professional force, forcing her to spin around. He slammed her hands together behind her back and locked the steel cuffs securely around her wrists. She screamed in pain and utter humiliation, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly across her face. The incredibly expensive cashmere coat she wore was violently twisted and bunched up around her shoulders. She looked absolutely feral, weeping openly, her dark makeup running down her pale cheeks, in thick, ugly streaks. "Let us go," the first agent commanded, giving Brad a firm shove toward the heavy oak doors. They were forcefully marched out of the executive boardroom. I stood silently next to Thomas Vance and Jonathan Vance, watching the miserable procession. The agents pushed them down the long, elegant hallway. The quiet, sophisticated atmosphere of the Oratech executive floor was completely shattered by Monica's hysterical screaming and Brad's pathetic, broken sobbing. Administrative assistants, junior executives, and corporate lawyers stepped out of their private offices, their eyes wide with absolute shock. They lined the hallway, watching the high-profile hedge fund manager and his glamorous wife being paraded through the building in heavy steel handcuffs like common street thugs. The public humiliation was absolute and entirely inescapable. Every single person on that floor watched them burn. The federal agents forced them into the elevator, and the heavy metal doors finally slid shut, cutting off Monica's frantic screaming. But the humiliation was not over. I knew that in exactly 2 minutes, those elevator doors would open into the massive, crowded glass lobby on the ground floor. Hundreds of people, including security personnel, receptionists, and visiting executives, would watch them being dragged out into the bright Manhattan sunlight and thrown directly into the back of a waiting federal transport vehicle. Their reputations, their wealth, and their entire future were completely eradicated in a matter of minutes. I turned slowly back to the massive window. I looked down at the busy city streets 50 stories below, feeling the cold glass against my fingertips. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the absolute silence of the empty room finally wash over my profoundly exhausted but entirely peaceful soul. It was finally and truly over. 3 months later, the freezing winter winds of the Hudson Valley had surrendered to the promising warmth of early spring. Melting snow gave way to vibrant green patches across my pastures, signaling profound renewal. But before I could fully embrace the peace of the farm, I had one final, crucial battle to fight. This battle did not take place in a towering skyscraper overlooking Manhattan. It took place in the solemn, heavily wood-paneled chambers of the county family court. I sat straight-backed at the petitioner's table, wearing the same dark navy suit I had worn on the day I dismantled my son's life. Beside me sat Thomas Vance, his presence as steady and reassuring as a stone wall. Across the aisle, sitting silently at the respondent's table, were Bradley and Monica, waiting for judgment. They were entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant couple who strutted into the Oratech boardroom. The expensive suits and extravagant cashmere coats were long gone. In their place were the dull, ill-fitting orange jumpsuits of the Federal Detention Center. Their wrists and ankles were bound by heavy chains that rattled loudly against the wooden floorboards every time they shifted in their seats. They looked gaunt, completely exhausted, and thoroughly broken. Their high-profile lawyers abandoned them the moment federal indictments were unsealed and their bank accounts frozen. They were now represented by public defenders who barely looked at them. The federal prosecutors had built an absolutely airtight case of wire fraud, criminal extortion, and conspiracy. Bradley and Monica were both facing a mandatory minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. But today was not about their financial crimes. Today was entirely about the innocent life they casually planned to throw away. The presiding judge was an older woman with sharp eyes and an incredibly stern demeanor. She peered over her reading glasses at the massive stack of evidentiary files Thomas had submitted. The courtroom was dead silent as she picked up a transcription booklet. I had submitted the audio recording from the kitchen that destroyed them in the corporate boardroom. The judge read the transcript silently, her lips thinning into a hard line of disgust. She did not even need to play the audio out loud. The printed words were more than enough. She looked up and fixed her severe gaze directly on Monica. To casually discuss abandoning a child with special needs simply to facilitate a life of stolen luxury is perhaps the most sickening display of parental negligence I have witnessed in my 30 years on the bench. The judge stated, her voice echoing sharply through the quiet room. Monica kept her head completely bowed, her greasy hair falling over her face, tears dripping silently onto her shackled hands. She did not dare to look up or defend herself. The judge then turned her piercing attention to Bradley. "And you, sir," she continued, her tone dripping with contempt. "You conspired to lock your father in a psychiatric ward to steal his estate, and you agreed to discard your son because your wife deemed him an inconvenience. You are both entirely unfit to hold the title of parents." The judge picked up her heavy wooden gavel. Without a moment of hesitation, she declared her final ruling. She stripped Bradley and Monica of all parental rights, severing their legal ties to the boy. With a sharp strike of the gavel, the judge granted me full, permanent custody of my grandson. Chains rattled loudly as bailiffs stepped forward, pulling Brad and Monica out of their chairs to escort them back to their holding cells. As Brad was led past my table, he looked at me one last time. His eyes begged for a tiny shred of mercy or a final word of comfort. I did not give him either. I simply turned my back to him and shook Thomas's hand. An hour later, I was driving my dusty Ford pickup down the highway toward the Hudson Valley. Sitting in the passenger seat next to me was little Leo. He had been quietly waiting in a private room with a kind social worker. When I told him he was coming to live with me at the farm permanently, he did not say a word, but he reached out and tightly gripped my calloused hand. The long drive home was wonderfully quiet, filled only with the soft, steady hum of the heavy truck engine and the gentle, comforting rhythm of the large tires rolling smoothly on the dark asphalt. When we pulled into the gravel driveway, the late afternoon sun was casting a golden glow across the rolling hills and green forests. The old red barn stood tall and proud against the clear blue sky. I put the truck in park and turned off the engine. I opened the passenger door for Leo. He stepped out onto the gravel, his bright wandering eyes taking in the vast open space. For years he had been trapped in a tense, loveless house, constantly yelled at for simply existing, treated as an embarrassing burden by the two people who were supposed to love him most. But here, the air was entirely different. My old sheepdog came trotting around the corner of the porch, his tail wagging furiously. He walked right up to Leo and gently nudged his wet nose against the boy's small hand. Leo looked down at the dog, and then he looked up at me. For the first time in his entire life, the deep, anxious tension that always tightened his small shoulders completely melted away. A soft, genuine smile spread across his face. He crouched down and wrapped his thin arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in the warm fur. I stood there quietly, watching my grandson, feeling the heavy, frozen block of ice deep inside my chest finally begin to thaw completely. The painful war was completely over. The farm was safe, and the boy was finally home where he truly belonged. Exactly 1 year has passed since that fateful night. The tall, antique grandfather clock standing in the long hallway is currently chiming exactly 8 times its deep, resonant tones, echoing softly through the quiet, peaceful farmhouse. Outside, a heavy winter storm is blanketing the Hudson Valley in a thick, pristine layer of fresh white snow. The fierce wind is howling fiercely against the frosted window panes, but inside the house is incredibly warm and entirely safe. There are no expensive crystal glasses clinking tonight. There is no elaborate beef Wellington brought up from the city, and there are certainly no arrogant men wearing $80,000 rose gold watches sitting at my dining table. The heavy, suffocating tension that poisoned this home 12 months ago has been completely eradicated. In its place is a profound, unshakable peace. I am sitting comfortably in my wonderfully worn leather armchair right next to the massive stone fireplace. The thick oak logs are crackling loudly, sending warm orange light dancing across the rustic wooden walls. Sitting on the thick woven rug right at my feet is my grandson, Leo. He is wearing a simple, comfortable flannel shirt and thick woolen socks. He is holding a long wooden stick with a perfectly toasted marshmallow on the end. Our faithful old sheepdog is resting his heavy head gently right on Leo's lap, occasionally opening one eye to watch the sweet treat hovering near the flames. Leo is smiling. It is a genuine, bright, and completely relaxed smile. Over the past year, the boy has transformed in ways I never thought possible. The anxious, terrified child, who used to shrink into the shadows, is completely gone. The open space of the farm, the quiet routine of tending the animals, and the absolute certainty that he is unconditionally loved have worked a miracle on his soul. He is no longer treated as a burden or a painful inconvenience. He is the absolute center of my world, and he knows it. He pulls the stick back carefully, slides the golden-brown marshmallow off the wood, and takes a bite, humming softly to himself in absolute contentment. I reach down and gently ruffle his hair. He leans into my hand completely at peace. Just a few miles away, safely hidden behind a thick line of towering pine trees on the far edge of the property, the new Auratech data center is currently under construction. It operates quietly, bringing no disruption to our daily lives. But every single month, like clockwork, a massive lease payment is securely wired directly into the irrevocable trust account I established for Leo. The wealth generating from this land is securing his future for the rest of his natural life. He will never have to worry about anything. He will always be protected long after I am gone. As for Bradley and Monica, they are currently sitting in separate federal penitentiaries, wearing identical orange jumpsuits, completely stripped of their dignity and their freedom. Their high society friends abandoned them immediately. Their luxurious assets were seized and liquidated by the federal government to pay back the clients they had so ruthlessly defrauded. They have absolutely no power left to hurt anyone ever again. They are nothing more than a dark, distant memory, a painful chapter of my life that has been firmly and permanently closed. I do not feel anger toward them anymore. I do not feel anything at all. I look away from the crackling fire and look directly out into the room. I think back to that arrogant toast my son made exactly 1 year ago today. He raised his glass of expensive red wine and mockingly declared that it would be my last Christmas on the farm. A slow, quiet smile spreads across my face as I realize the profound irony of his cruel words. Brad's toast was actually completely right. It was the last Christmas, but it was the last Christmas for him. Just yesterday afternoon, I sat in my attorney's office and confidently signed the final legal paperwork to purchase another 100 acres of adjoining pasture using the surplus Auratech lease money. Because unlike flesh and blood, land never lies. It never plots against you in the dark, and it never tries to throw away the innocent. Loyalty is the only true currency that actually matters in this world, and I have found mine right here with my grandson. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If this narrative resonated with you, or if it gave you the courage to stand up to the toxic people in your own life, please share it with others. Because somewhere out there, someone else is being used by their own family, and they desperately need to know that they are not completely alone. They need to know that they can fight back, and that true survival is absolutely possible. Blood is simply not enough to justify abuse. Love is entirely meaningless without basic respect. And sometimes the family you build with your own hands is so much better than the family you were given. I learned that lesson the incredibly hard way so that you do not have to. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from tonight? Let us meet down in the comments section below. If you really liked the story, you can support my channel by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing you more incredible life stories just like this one. Thank you so much for your sweet, continuous support. I am really looking forward to reading your thoughts and comments on this journey. On your screen right now, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend you watch next. There is so much more content waiting for you on my channel. Do not forget to hit the subscribe button so we can stay connected. I will see you in the next life story. With love and absolute respect.